I am Donaldo Macedo from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Well, first of all, I think that linguistics, as any other field, first and foremost, should be engaged in ethical work. And I have been denouncing over many years the fact that we are not encouraged to study ethics, even though when we are educators, and educators should be first and foremost, ethical individuals. A teacher who is a racist should not be in the classroom. A teacher who discriminates should not be in the classroom. She should be weed out, or he should be weed out. So because I was trained in linguistics mostly to be a technician in the analysis of linguistic structures, from theory to practice, I was never really even asked to think about language as my philosophy of language. For example, in my class today, I begin by asking students to tell me, we prepare, master students in applied linguistics. They are going to be language teachers. Some of them go on to do a PhD. At the master's level, I ask them to give me, without thinking, their philosophy of language. They don't have it, and they struggle to write, 2 or 3 phrases, 2 or 3 sentences. So for me then, not knowing the philosophy of the very field of study, that you have invested so many years, that you have been given degrees and so on and so forth. You're going to be a professional in that field and so on and so forth. You don't know, and you may engage unknowingly in unethical behavior, and because you were not basically challenged to think of the ramification of the language. For example, in the talk this afternoon, I was talking about, the academic language as a language that in many ways not lies, because, it often, encouraged the use of euphemism rather than a language that really names reality. For example, as the example that I gave, we, in the middle class, reality, academic discourse in the so-called mainstream American schools, we avoid, the use of the term oppressed. Then we come up with, dozens of euphemisms. We go to great lengths to not name, the oppressed. And then we use disenfranchised, marginalized, economically marginal, at risk, minority, and so on and so forth. My question is, why do we avoid using oppressed? And the reason that we avoid using oppressed, because we remain uncomfortable in unpacking a reality where you have oppressors. Because if you have the oppressed, you have to have oppressed. Disenfranchised, and it removes the subject of the action, and we don't know who really is doing the disenfranchisement. So if we ask the question, who disenfranchised whom, we don't have an answer. Because we don't have to answer, we don't have to be accountable linguistically, then it is preferable to use that. It's less offensive. You don't make people who are, adhering or embracing, oppressive conditions, to be accountable. So language then, since is an important tool in naming reality, in creating reality, in that we constitute language, but as has been said by many others before me, we are also constituted by it. Therefore, we cannot frame a reality without language. So if language plays that central role, in our becoming, then we need to really understand it, one, critically, but also understand it ethically understand the ramification, what it means to be ethical linguistically, i.e., we don't discriminate by labeling those who do not speak the language as a native speaker, to think that they are less than we are because they don't master our language. Because if we are asked, if I ask you, for example, to give the same talk that I'm giving, for example, in Portuguese, you would not be able to say much because you don't speak Portuguese. It's not your fault that you don't speak Portuguese, but I don't really associate your lack of skills, your lack of mastery in Portuguese with being less intelligent, or being intellectually deficient. That's what we do with millions of immigrant students in the United States because of their temporary English language barrier. You see, they are labeled as special education kids, not able to, they are tracked into non-college, tracks and so on and so forth. So it begins with language because language is so central, so important, to our future, to our becoming, being ethical, in language study is fundamental in my view.